There we go. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Page. I'm the president of ISHE for 2021 and also the director of engineering down at Good Samaritan Hospital in Vincennes, Indiana. So I would like to, first of all, thank everyone for joining this virtual event. I want to say a special thank you to Brad at Purdue University to help work with us to set this up, obviously with the ISHE board, and likewise to the students there in the classroom that will be joining us today and the other members. One thing we would tell each and every one of you if we were there in person would be look around, know where your nearest exit is in case there's an emergency. Put that plug in for Vic because I know he talked about that last year. So regardless whether we're in person or not, you should know where your nearest exit location is. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about introductions. We're going to turn this over to Brad for a little information from the Purdue University side. So Brad, it's all yours.
All right, thanks guys. Just let me do a sound check because we got a couple things we're trying to manage on multiple screens here. Can you guys see my presentation?
We can, and we can hear you.
What's that? And you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Can you see the students? Everyone,
Yes.
students?
Not that big.
You guys all see the Purdue students?
Yes, we do.
All right, good. We have to be nice to them because they're going to build our nursing homes.
Amen.
You don't land jokes quite as well virtually, right? So
I was just going to say, hurry, please.
all right, so just to kind of give, I want you guys to kind of understand what our students are seeing is they're seeing the presentation, but we can't see your videos at the same time. But we are able to start seeing people logging in. So we got 35 people involved. We're watching that. And, our goal here is I'll take about 15 minutes to highlight these young people in the program we have here. And then I'll be handing the baton off for ISHE updates and such, and then some great guest speakers. So we're very excited about it. And so obviously we're transmitting it to you guys from Purdue. Many of you guys have been here when we've done our presentation before. And we've done it out at IURNet, and then we recently did it here at the Purdue Stewart Center. So we are very optimistic and hopeful to be able to do this with you guys again next year in person, if you will. So bear with me a minute while I'm trying to get things to move here. I realize my clicker won't work when I'm in GoToMeeting, so I got to stand behind here. So welcome to Purdue in a virtual setting, if you will. As you can see from looking, if you can see in the camera with our students, you can all see that they're wearing their masks, and we are working with, sorry guys. Working with our Purdue Protect Purdue plan. And then we also are part of the Purdue Polytechnic. So within Purdue, there's the colleges, and then there's the Polytechnic, if you will, which is our college, and that's where the School of Construction Management is. And so I've just got some pictures here to kind of highlight of what we do. Obviously, we're teaching construction management. Our students go to work for many of the large contractors and specialty contractors across the country here in Indiana. And since we started the healthcare program, we've been placing a lot of students in other parts of the program. We're very proud, obviously, this was taken before COVID hit us, of doing a lot of industry engagement. This was last year's Building Academy, where some of you participated in this. That's Craig Burgess, the Indiana Building Commissioner, where we brought everybody in Indiana together to talk about code compliance and plan review and how do we build more resilient buildings and everything. And so we're optimistic that we're going to have that back here in person in November. We also have continuing education programs. This is part of our site supervision program, working with foremen and facilities folks on some of the technical project management skills and some of the soft skills of leadership for people who move into those new positions. And this is our Sigma Lambda Chi is our honor society for our students. Our students do a lot of philanthropy work. Obviously, you're going to tell by the end of this presentation, we're very proud of our students. in everything they've been doing. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about how the Purdue's been handling the Protect Purdue plan. We have been open and in person since last fall. Obviously, we have protocols. You guys can see all the students here. You can see that they're spread out more. We have to be working in classrooms with double occupancy from what we normally do. You can't see in the picture, but there's lots of buckets of wipes, and these students come in and they will wipe down their seats before we start. We'll do our class and then they clean things down. And we've actually been very good at keeping the containment of the virus here on campus to a low number so that we've been able to stay open in person. It has affected our schedule and how we do schedule. The students, unfortunately, hey students, are you guys happy about losing spring break? You guys can do this, you're allowed, right? They don't like losing spring break, but the calendar was changed so that we didn't have a mass exodus of students traveling the country. So that, you know, again, I think all these students would tell you is that they'd rather be here on campus with the protocols rather than working remotely from mom and dad's house. So telling you a little bit about the healthcare construction management program here at Purdue. So these students you see here, and there's some off screen that you can't see, but every semester we have a group of students who voluntarily, it's not required, they can choose to go through a concentration. They can do residential, demolition, disaster restoration, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, residential, or healthcare. And so these students chose to go through healthcare. And so they're on a journey, if you will, with me and many of you as partners to get a better understanding, and hopefully we get them excited and engaged in healthcare construction. And I got to remind everyone, I know many people on this call or this webinar are related directly to hospitals, but that we also cover everything related to the healthcare built environment, including nursing homes, aging in place, clinics, medical office buildings, anything related to that, in addition to hospitals. So some of the things about us, we are with a specialization within the program, and we are very dovetailed with ISHE. And so my good friend Tim Adams, he and I go way back. I know he's on this call, and I'm looking forward to having him talk. I have to call him out for he's been an advocate for us when he was at ISHE, and ISHE and ISHE have been phenomenal at helping us get going. And we are the first student chapter. I'll tell you a little bit more about that here in a little bit, but very active outside the classroom. We're continuing partnerships with ISHE on the certification programs. So again, back to Tim, he and I worked together many years ago establishing the curriculum that I teach. And then in combination of doing things like these meetings, the students are able to get their certifications through ISHE, which is a wonderful accolade for them to have on their resumes. And it's all done pro bono. So we appreciate that. So hopefully the resounding message of thank you is very important in here. And so we're also doing the I-Corps CC, working with our, and I'm sure if I were to scroll through the screen, we'd have some of those folks on the call, but our the Carpenters Union, United Brotherhood of Carpenters, we worked with them on their infection control, and they come into the classroom, and our students, like all students, love to do hands-on stuff, and so they get their credential through the UBC, and we're very appreciative of that. We have a great trainer, Dan Jones, helps us with that, and we've just got some great partners with them, and so we'll be starting that in a couple of weeks here as well. Obviously, I think some of you guys are very familiar with their certification program. And last year I had the opportunity to speak at the I'm not a big word guy, Epinesologists conference that was hosted by them. And that was a real privilege last year. So thank you to our partners there. And then I've just got some pictures here of, again, we're challenged right now with COVID. You can tell by my pictures, this was pre-pandemic. So we normally get to go out. Our friends, Ben Stouffer there in the bottom, and our friends at UBC have allowed us to kind of run through their facilities as playgrounds, and we're a little bit restricted now on that. So if anyone has virtual videos or anything, we welcome that. If anyone wants to log in to our classroom and walk through their facility and allow us to do that, we would appreciate that. We're learning our way right today. So on the classroom wall, you can imagine two very large flat panel TVs the students are watching. And we, those are great opportunities for us to see things. So again, for this group of students, any help you guys can give us there, we appreciate. So some of the things we do in the program is we do go through the alphabet soup. The students are working through currently now all the different departments of the facilities. We've gone through ICRA. We talk about negative air. So the conversations before this class talked about negative air and how we've increased that so much because of COVID and how that's affecting the buildings. That's something these young people can appreciate and understand. And these are just some of the other things that we're dealing with as we go through this program. Again, it's an awareness and an understanding. Again, we've had some real great opportunities to get out and explore. We typically go to the Midwest Healthcare Engineering Show in the fall, and we will do more field trips, and then we also go to the PDC Summit. And so sadly, we were literally packed up and ready to head to the airport in March to go to San Antonio, but we obviously had to pull the plug on that. And so ISHE, for those of you who don't know, is one of our big sponsors that help get these young people out to those conferences. And we appreciate the donations you guys make. Again, this year you guys donated, you increased your donation to these young people to $5,000. And so that money, we guard it. We're very rigorous with it. The students are very frugal with it, and it's basically used to get them to this conference. So we're optimistic that we're going to get back on the wagon when we get going. By the way, they were very excited to hear New Orleans. All right, so how can you guys help us? Obviously we're trying to create the next generation, but we're always looking for guest speakers. We're always looking for case studies. We're looking for equipment. We obviously have some limited space, but Abatement Technologies has been wonderful to us in giving us some of the equipment. So we have a portable containment unit these folks have gone through. In their previous class, they had to do estimating without a portable containment unit going through a case study. Then they used a portable containment unit and had to re-estimate the amount of time and safety procedures. So they can now appreciate the challenges you all have. And then obviously interns. So the students we're working with here, you guys, by show of hands, how many of you guys are juniors? Pretty much all of you are juniors. So they all have at least one more summer of internship. By the way, our program has 800 hours of internship hours they have to do. And we've had some of our students work during the school year at local hospitals, which has been wonderful. So just to put a plug out there, and I'm sure Tim will reinforce this in a few minutes, is ISHE has financial opportunities through their scholarship programs to help fund interns at your hospitals or at your facilities. All you have to do is ask for it, put together an application, and then it's a way to get one of these young people to help you in your programs. And we know budgets are tight these days, especially with the reduction of elective surgeries that happened last year and everything else that everyone's dealing with. So those internship scholarships are really important. So we appreciate those. Again, these were some of the equipment that we've been able to have. We also do capstone projects. So the previous students who went through the healthcare program who are currently in our senior capstone project, they're working on design build projects right now. Right now we have a group of students working on a surgery center here in West Lafayette where they have to do a full-blown design estimate, design build proposal, schedule, logistics, safety, everything else. And then again, another plug, we're always looking for industry people to help judge those. We normally do that in person, but due to COVID, we actually transitioned that all to an in real time, like we're doing right now, interaction on Zoom. And so that's actually been going very well. This might seem like a funny picture, but this was one of the things that we did with the students a couple years ago out at IURNet, was they had our students come out and put GoPros on wheelchairs and kind of go through the hospital and do an ADA assessment. And it was done kind of in the spirit of a learning experience for our students to appreciate that. But what indirectly happened was that we ended up finding some areas for some, I got to politely say it, some areas of improvement for the hospital of things that they discovered just from a perspective of going through the hospital and auditing it in wheelchairs. So again, just some of the fun things we can do. We're always looking for what we call applied research here. And that's one of those things, whether it's undergraduates. And then we've also had some of our graduate students work with the hospital And it seems like it wasn't intentional, but it seems like we ended up with a lot of graduate students who did some really deep dives into energy efficiency studies for facilities and some of the data analytics that goes with some of that, and really kind of measuring, if you will, asset management. And if we have a limited budget of money, where do we spend it? And so those are some of the areas we love to work with. You can always reach out to me if you're interested on that. Like I mentioned, we have a student chapter here. Just some more photos of students going off and traveling, interacting with industry. More conferences, some of the great equipment we've gotten. I pulled this picture. It's just, we really enjoy going to the PDC. If you can't tell, we're very thirsty for travel these days and getting out of Lafayette. We also, some of you might have been involved. We've done some of the student competitions before over the years, in where we, the AIA Student Challenge, where I'll bring a group of construction management students to the conference, and then through a selection of 4 other programs, architects, engineers, and we'll mix teams together, people who've never worked together, and in a matter of 48 hours, they'll develop a complete proposal for a healthcare facility in whatever town we're doing the challenge in. And so the last one, we've done this twice now and really enjoyed it. It's a lot of fun. I've actually taken a lot of learning lessons from that back to our Capstone program here at Purdue. Again, you don't have to look at the details, but these were some of the deliverables that these young people, many of them probably under 21 years old, were developing. So obviously we're very proud of them. Just some more examples. And so I end this with a resounding, as I say every year when we meet with you folks, is a big thank you on behalf of the students. So thank you. Yell out, students, yell thank you, just so they know you're here. Yeah, we really appreciate what you guys do for us. And so I guess I'll open it up for questions. I'm going to turn off my presentation if it's all right with you guys, because we can't see your cameras when my presentation's going. So I'm not sure how to stop sharing, Melissa, or do you take it back from me?
I think I can stop you, so just 1 second. All right. Can you just see videos, no screens right now?
You'll have to ask someone besides Purdue.
Or anybody else on the call?
Yeah, we can see the video screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And thank you to all our attendees for your patience during our transitions here. We got a lot of players, more than usual, doing this virtually and on a platform new to several people. So thank you. And just FYI, Steve, you're presenter now, but you don't obviously need to start sharing your screen till later. So questions for Brad now and his students.
Melissa, this is where in virtual worlds, everyone gets really quiet.
All right, then I guess we'll leave it up to our esteemed board president, Mr. Page, maybe to ask a couple questions and talk about ISHE updates if Brad doesn't have anything else for us.
No, I'm good on our end. So we'll just gonna sit back and take our notes, and we look forward to the presentation. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Again, thank you, Brad, for the presentation and information. This was very impressive. I've not had the fortune of being up there during one of your sessions previously, so this was really good for me, and just to get to see what the students are doing there is very impressive. Would love to, we're way down in the southern part of the state, but would love to get some of you down here. We've got a fairly new facility with Patient Tower and a new energy center that's 6 years old or so now, so there's a lot of neat things down here, so maybe you and I can talk offline sometime, but thank you for that. So just a little bit about ISHE, and again, I don't want to take up too much time, but I guess first of all, I'll just share, I've been in healthcare 10 years, so I'm not a lifetime healthcare person per se. I've been in the engineering field for 35 years, and I can say without a doubt, there's been nothing more rewarding in my life, with the exception of children and grandchildren, than to see the impact on what you can have on a patient or a family member or something of that nature in a healthcare setting. And whether you're building the facility, which I've been involved in, obviously, or working in the facility on a day-to-day basis, at the end of the day, you know, you're going to hear a story at some point of something that you did or had just a fraction of support in to make a difference in somebody's lives, and that can't be talked about enough. You know, that, you know, I know every ISHE board member and ISHE member has stories of how they've been involved in those types of things. So that is it's a very rewarding. So I don't know at what point, does anybody know at what point in my wonderful speech that I was lost?
I think you had just finished talking just about how fabulous ISHE is and encouraging people, our students and everyone else to stay active and become involved.
Okay. So, you know, we talk about advantages of ISHE and, you know, that professional development. I kind of touched on that a little bit with training events, but, you know, the professional networking that you get from an organization like this is phenomenal. You really can't underestimate the value of that. And we really experienced that through 2020 with, you know, what everyone was facing with the pandemic, and being able to brainstorm and interact with each other to bounce ideas off of on how you're going to handle certain things. You know, you can obviously learn a lot in school, and you should stay in school, but, you know, that professional networking development, you know, with I'll use Tim, even though I didn't ask him. You know, Tim is an example who's been in healthcare forever, has forgotten more things than I'll ever know. To be able to utilize those type of people to help come up with the right solution for an event is phenomenal. So obviously, you know, scholarships, you know, was talked about what ISHE does there. We also have a couple different scholarship programs. Interaction with facilities, you know, again, we go pre-COVID, you know, we were doing monthly facility tours where people could showcase their facility and again, develop that relationship and discussion around how different things were handled at the organizations is really valuable information. Brad mentioned the Midwest Conference in the fall of the year. This year it is November 8th through the 10th. So right now we're heavy in the planning stages of that. And then also the spring conference, which is in May at French Lick, May 12th through the 14th. A couple different areas of focus, you know, at the spring conference, it's kind of centered around codes and requirements, you know, state requirements, and Joint Commission, for example, our guest speakers that are there, along with some others. Where the Midwest Conference, you know, you get a little more general sessions. We've had the Indiana Hospital Association there the last couple of years, giving a little bit of a unique presentation for facility guys and things you may not hear day in and day out, along with breakout sessions and networking opportunities again at Midwest. But you guys are somewhat familiar with that. And I think probably one of the big things about it is as you look at those conferences and the training and interaction, you know, everything that we're facing, our discussions are more specific to Indiana. You know, you can go to events and virtually, obviously, anywhere in the country, and things you may hear in a California event, you know, okay, maybe not just completely apply to what we see in Indiana. So, you know, that's a great thing that you can really develop those relationships with people here in your back door. Be a little remiss if I didn't mention ISHE. Obviously, you know, we're connected very closely with ISHE, and all the additional training and network you get through that organization as well. Their training opportunities are endless, you know, on the ISHE website. So we thank them for their support and as well. That's kind of it on an ISHE update. I will try to answer any questions. Obviously, any of the other members, board members or so, could also try to answer them as well. But wanted to kind of just give you an update, oversight on ISHE as it stands. Any questions before I turn it back over to Melissa to introduce our speakers?
Hey, Don, this is Don, Melissa. This is Ben Stauffer. I just wanted to drift back. I was trying to raise my hand. Melissa got everything all ironed out from a technology standpoint for us. Back to Brad's presentation. I typed in a comment that probably wasn't shared with everybody, but the presentations, I judged those one year, and I was really blown away by what the students presented. How thorough they were and what they put through, and then even handled some of the questions. I messed with them a little bit because one of them was doing a presentation over the for a bridge over the Wabash, and I asked them how they were going to deal with the possible extinction of the mussels, and they really handled it quite well. I think all of us in our past have had a presentation where somebody just asked a real off the wall question, and you're like, okay, how am I going to handle that one? But they did a really good job, and I just wanted to express that, and also, I appreciate the times that we have been able to here with the proximity. Brad mentioned IU a few times. It's actually IU Health, Tim. I use that nasty place down south. But no, it's a great partnership. I think we have. It can always get better. It's exciting when the students come out, and like he said, he was trying to cautiously say that we had found places that we needed to fix. One of those things going around with the wheelchairs. It was enlightening for all of us. It was a really good time. Appreciate what they do, and appreciate the opportunities to work with Brad and the students.
I will say there was one other question that came in, Brad, is kind of along the lines of what type of equipment would most benefit your students. That may be something you can share some now, or provide us some information that we can share with the membership. We could not hear you, Brad, if you were speaking.
Purdue students, can you hear us? Can you raise your hand there in the classroom if you can hear us? All right, awesome. So maybe it's just an issue with Brad. We'll follow up and get a list of equipment, and plan to post that on the website and or email that out if that's good with everyone. I'm sure between all of our facilities, probably have more than we know sitting around in closets somewhere or what have you that we could try to help out. All right, anything else from you, Don?
No, I think that's it. Thank you.
All right. I'm Melissa McCain. I'm a member of the ISHE board, and I am at Methodist University, downtown Indianapolis today. And if you see me looking up, it's because I took advantage of being in a conference room that has windows, which I don't normally get exposed to during the day. And there's a little bit of sunlight, so I'm pretty excited about that. I just want to thank, as Don did, the students at Purdue and Brad. Last year was my first year participating in this event, and I came away just very, very impressed. And like you all, I was very disappointed that PDC was canceled last year. And I think I know myself and most of us board members and just colleagues in general in this industry are missing conferences terribly. So not only the chance, to see colleagues from throughout the state and the country, but there's great education out there. And I know we're going to hear some more of that here in a few minutes. So with that said, it is my honor to introduce two people who have played huge roles in my professional development. And especially because many of you know I didn't come from a traditional background. I certainly wasn't a construction management student. I was liberal arts all the way, ended up here by chance. And when I was featured in Voice of ISHE and other things, I can honestly say that I probably wouldn't still be here 8 years later if it weren't for Steve Sponbert from MSL and his colleagues. So I am proud to know him, to consider him a mentor, and very excited and grateful that he agreed to give up some of his time to present to you all today. I know this is one of his favorite events. And likewise, we have a man who needs no introduction because he is a legacy in our state and throughout the country as well, Mr. Tim Adams. I'm proud to say he's a fellow team member now at IU Health, where he is our director of system-wide environment of care and life safety. And in fact, I think he's at one of our hospitals, maybe in Muncie today, doing a mock survey with one of Steve's consultants. A great example of important relationships and taking advantage of those in this industry. Most of you know that prior to coming to IU Health, Tim was with ISHE for a long time and is very instrumental in ISHE's advocacy efforts and continues to be very involved as an ISHE member now and keeping us abreast of different ISHE advocacy topics. He also at IU Health, one of the things I know we have most appreciated last year is in his role, he's the one that we get the emails from usually at sometimes the middle of the night that says the governor's extended the public health emergency, or waivers extended. And I know lots of those we've shared with our ISHE colleagues and everything else. So I asked them both for fun facts because I always like to go over more than just resumes with people, and you can always read those online. But you may see in a minute from Steve's office, he is an avid sailing and surfing enthusiast. And many of you may have heard Mr. Adams play guitar before. I think he did at our Midwest Healthcare Conference a couple of years ago. But he also is the distinguished characteristic of being born in Brazil, and that's Brazil, Indiana, not far from where I grew up. So anyway, thank you both, and I'm going to turn it over to Tim, and then I think Keely's going to pass things on to Steve.
We can't tell if you're talking, Tim, but we've got no audio.
Tim has been officially named the presenter, and I certainly hope we didn't lose him just as he was going to start talking. And Mr. Sponbrook, I'm laughing because I made these myself during a recent conference.
I'm not sure how you're. I'm not sure
I don't know why I didn't think of like is a Be Right Back and stuff. I don't know why I didn't think of them a year ago, but they've been very very helpful. So when people like looking for feedback and everything, But anyway, let's give him just a second and see if Tim joins us.
It looks like Melissa or someone may have gone in and muted the presenters.
Am I still muted?
So I've unmuted them. Can you talk now?
Am I on now?
Yes, you are. Thank you, Tim.
Okay,
Yeah.
Great. Well, it's good to be here with you today, and good to see the Purdue students. When I transitioned from working for ISHE to coming to IU Health, one of the things that I spent a lot of time with at ISHE was working with universities around the country. And I don't get to do as much of that now. I can say with no doubt that the healthcare specialty in the construction management program at Purdue is the best there is. It is just a stellar program. I think there's a couple of graduates working in our healthcare system actually, and I run into them as contractors are doing work for us, run into Purdue graduates that came through the healthcare program. And so appreciate what Brad is doing there and what you students, what you're involved in. We need the help. Believe me, we need the help. There's a lot going on in our world, and in the world of healthcare, there's great opportunity. We always are doing construction, and you'd think sooner or later everything's new, but our buildings, the average age of our buildings is quite old across the country. There's just a world of opportunity in healthcare construction. So good to have all of you involved in that. The poster boards that were on the display earlier from the design competition, I don't know if Brad mentioned, but those designs, when they went to the design challenge at the PDC conference, they developed that in 48 hours, starting on a Monday morning, and by I think 7 o'clock Sunday morning, they have to or they start on a Friday morning. By Sunday morning at 7, they have to have everything done. And then the judging takes place later in the day. Just incredible what teams of students from around the country come together and learn how to do this design. And I remember very well one of the competitions, one of the groups, and there was a Purdue student in the group, as well as a couple of architectural students, a nursing student, engineering student from different universities who just met, on Friday morning of the competition. They meet their team members, and they were wanting to do something, and the Purdue student kept telling them, but you can't do that. The code doesn't allow it. And the other students were wanting to oh, it doesn't matter. We can design that way. We can do that. And it's like, no, the code doesn't allow it. All of us in facility management and in accreditation and compliance, we appreciate you standing up and saying the code does not allow that. So just thank you for being here today. I'm not going to spend very much time because we are so blessed to have Steve Sponbrook here with us today. And plus I have to run and go act like I'm working and do something here this afternoon. So I will have to drop off in a bit. But I just wanted to share about a couple of things going on that affect our world and in the physical environment of healthcare. Obviously, COVID has been a challenge. Early on, a lot of hospitals stopped doing where they could elective surgeries. Tried to be ready for a peak in COVID that we didn't know exactly where or how big it was going to be, and rode through that. The summer numbers dropped, and then they came way back up. And we have adapted our facilities to be able to provide care. In some areas, in some parts of the country, they've had to go to non-hospital places to provide inpatient care. I think in Indiana, we haven't had to do as much of that, perhaps, as New York and some other places have. But it has been quite a challenge, and the design and construction part of our world has been a big part of that, as we have needed to adapt to what was going on and be able to sometimes quickly do a renovation or a construction on the fly to prepare to have places to take care of patients and serve those who were in need. We have been able to make use of several waivers, federal as well as state waivers, to allow us to adapt areas where we could provide care. And I think Don mentioned creating negative pressure. And as we've been able to create many negative pressure rooms where we could isolate patients, and sometimes doing that very quickly. Many people worked, more than once through the night to provide a place for that. And as that has happened, we've been able to make use of these waivers. At some point, those will go away, if you will, and we will be returning to what we call normal. I don't think we know what normal is going to be, because what will be the next pandemic? When will there be another wave? There's things we speculate, and the experts will, try to give their very best advice. But if anything through this, I think we've learned that we need our facilities to be adaptable, and we need to be able to adapt to varying levels and types of care quickly. And perhaps down the road, that's going to inform our codes and standards that we work with, things like the FGI guidelines. It may inform the speed with which regulatory agencies will provide waivers so that we can do things to adapt. I believe that's probably the biggest message going forward with COVID, is just learning to be more adaptable and prepared for that. I wanted to mention just one thing from a regulatory side. And Brad, you mentioned that you talk about all kinds of medical buildings in your classes, not just hospitals. And that's very appropriate, because for folks that have accredited services in business occupancies, there is an increased scrutiny on business occupancies. And in the past, and I'll speak specifically to Joint Commission, our organization, all of our facilities are Joint Commission accredited. Surveyors would go to those facilities that are business occupancies, but they really didn't look at life safety. They would look at, some very basic things. Do you have emergency lights? And, if I push the little button, will they come on? And, do you have exit signs, and are the exits open? Can I get out of the building? But the Joint Commission has, as of July, there will be specific life safety standards for business occupancies. This is something new for us. And surveyors are being trained to be much more vigilant. And I just was on a meeting with 2 surveyors last week, and I didn't particularly care what they talked about, but just the rigor with which the clinical surveyors will be looking at life safety and business occupancies. So I think it's something that all of us in healthcare facilities need to have our eye on. Need to be aware, and it's coming from CMS, so I don't think it's going to be just specific to one accrediting organization. This is a focus coming from CMS, and in the Joint Commission standards, things like travel distances, rating of shafts, and specific stairway requirements, and corridor widths, and some of the things that nobody paid as much attention to. They are now going to be paying a lot of attention to. So it becomes very imperative that we design and build those buildings correctly, and that we maintain them, and we are prepared for that. So just wanted to provide that as a bit of an update about something that I think is going to impact all of us from a regulatory standpoint, as we have more scrutiny in those business occupancy areas, medical office buildings, other services that are part of our hospital accreditations. So I'd love to talk for an hour, but I really enjoy much more hearing Steve, and what he's got to share today, I think, is just so vitally important to what we do in our healthcare facilities. So I would like to turn things over to Steve and let him get started.
Let me unmute. Okay, you guys hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can hear
Awesome.
you now. Thanks.
So first, I want to say you guys are far too kind. I've done a bunch of these. I've been introduced a bunch of times. Melissa, that was the nicest one I've ever had. But let me just tell you and assure you, you would have been just fine without us, because you got a lot going for you. So it's an honor to be here. I appreciate you guys inviting me back. I'm coming to you live from nowhere, coastal North Carolina. So I can assure you I'm properly socially distanced, but I gotta admit I feel a little bit gypped, because the last time I was there, I ended up at Harry's afterwards with a bunch of students having a good time, and that's definitely not going to be the case today. I hadn't really planned on starting my presentation out with this part of my discussion, but I think most of the ISHE folks will agree with this statement, is that healthcare is a passion. And I'm excited to see a bunch of young people in a room that are at least exploring that passion. And my own personal journey, and I think what triggered this thought that I wanted to discuss this momentarily, was seeing that wheelchair on the screen. And I immediately got transported back to a part of my time where I was about your age. Actually, I was 21 years old. And I don't know if you guys can see that or not, or make it out. I keep this on my desk. This is a little device. It and 3 others just like it were screwed into my skull for most of the final part of 1984 and the first half of 1985. I actually broke my neck in a water skiing accident on August 4th of 85 and was paralyzed from the neck down for a while. And so that's kind of when my personal journey started in healthcare. I didn't get into healthcare for probably 10 years after that. My degree was in construction management. But what I take away from that was probably the greatest blessing in my life. And I tell people that, and they look at me like I'm nuts. But what it gave me was a unique perspective on what it's like to be a patient in one of our organizations. A lot of people who are involved in healthcare never really, and I don't mean this negatively, but never get a chance to truly appreciate the impact they have on other people's lives until later in life when they become a healthcare consumer, because it's a whole different perspective. So I feel like I was really fortunate to have the opportunity to experience that beforehand. So now I got to figure out how to share my screen here again. So let's see, waiting to view. Well, it says waiting to view. There we go. Thank you, Melissa. That popped right up. So I just wanted to kind of share that little bit of my life and help you understand where that passion's coming from. And I'm excited that you guys have that opportunity to experience that. And that's a really creative way of doing it. But again, my name is Steve Sponbrook. I run a company called MSL Healthcare Partners. We do a lot of things, mostly accreditation stuff, and but we get heavily involved in construction, and that's one of my passions. I wanted to talk to you a little bit. I want to kind of set the playing field up by talking a little bit about what causes people to die in our country and some of the challenges we're facing in healthcare. And I actually stole this from a tweet. So anybody watching the video, hopefully I'm not breaking any copyright infringements here. I took this out of a tweet from Bill Gates, gosh, before COVID, so it's been a while back. But the context of the tweet was about what actually causes death, which is the far left column, what people tend to be interested in based on their Google searches, which is the immediate column to the right of that one, versus what is portrayed and covered in the media. And if you look at what actually causes death, heart disease and cancer are the number one, number two. They've been like that forever. I've been tracking this data probably 15 years now. They roughly account for about 600,000 deaths a year, and they're really neck and neck. And you can see how tight the percentages are between the two, and that's basically how they stay. But then the next item on his list is accidents and falls and car accidents and all those sorts of things, accounting for a little more than 7.5% of all the deaths on a yearly basis in our country. And then those fall way off, and you get the very bottom. In fact, it's too small to even fit the scale, or homicide and terrorism. But if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, what is the news media? What do we see in social media and the news and those sorts of things? What do they cover? Well, they cover the things that are going to make us come back to it, like terrorism and homicide and even suicide, are all disproportionately covered in terms of what really causes problems. And why that is relevant is because one of the biggest challenges we're facing in healthcare right now is the amount of people who are dying due to hospital-acquired infections and preventable medical errors. And I'm going to talk to that in just a second. But I thought, just for fun, when I was doing this, it's like, well, what are the things that are really dangerous in the world? And I know this has come to a shock to most of you guys with all the gray hair and my age, but I'm kind of a big-time gamer. I like to play games, PlayStation and computer. And I wanted to see, because sometimes I feel like I'm about to stroke out in the middle of one of those things. It's like, what are the odds of actually dying playing video game? Well, it's 1 in 1 million. That's pretty good. Of course, most people look more like him and have good cardiovascular system rather than me, who's getting closer and closer to that day when the heart's just going to blow up. But some of the other things, I think about bicycling. In this area of the country, there's a lot of bike trails and some big rides, and I always think, gee, that's kind of dangerous. I mean, out on the road riding a bike. Actually, it's not. One in about 141,000. The other one that I assumed would be really, really dangerous is this: skydiving. I've got friends. I'm a pilot, and I've got friends that fly, and they also skydive, and they're always trying to talk me into going. I'm like, you guys got to be nuts. There's no way I'm doing that. But the odds are actually pretty good. In fact, they're better than what you're probably going to do immediately when this COVID thing releases. And unfortunately, you're not going to get to do it during spring break, and I apologize for that. But going to a dance party, your odds are about 1 in 100,000 that you're going to die at a dance party. Maybe if I'm there, it might go up. I don't know. But something that we would do and probably not even think about, which is put our kids in a canoe on a camping trip and send them out on the pond. The odds go up tenfold, 1 in 10,000. One of the other things I really want to do before it's on my bucket list, hopefully not the last thing on my bucket list, but it could be, is hang gliding. And the odds go up significantly. They're about 1 in 560. And how is this relative to what we're doing? Well, right now, doing the math, if you look at the number of admissions that happen in our hospitals, the number of patients that we estimate die due to hospital-acquired infections, which is about 75,000, and those patients that we estimate die due to preventable medical errors, which is somewhere between about 45, and 98,000 deaths, your odds of dying just by being admitted to on one of our hospitals about 1 in 210. So over twice as likely as hang gliding. And to me, that's just unbelievable. And I have done this math so many different ways. I know it's accurate. It's still hard for me to conceive sometimes. But relative to construction, your odds of being a patient and dying due to an infection caused by construction or maintenance activities, we don't really separate those two, is about 1 in 7,400. But if you think about it, that's even more dangerous than going out and being on the canoe, right? So the odds are better, but they're still significant. and just kind of bring this into perspective, one of the things I think of particularly being very, very dangerous sport is Formula One racing. Yes, the odds are pretty high, 1 in 100 that you're going to die if you're a race car driver in Formula One, but they're only twice as high as they are if you're being a patient in one of our hospitals. And so how are we going about trying to solve that problem? Well, a lot of people have gotten on the bandwagon, Sullenberger being one of them. It's like, we've got to stop thinking about these as being unavoidable and start thinking about them as being unimaginable. And when I first read that, I was like, he's right. But there's also a problem with that. And that's kind of where I was for a long time in my career, I'll be honest about it, is thinking about this stuff being unimaginable means I can't really truly comprehend the problem. So it's very easy for me to go, you know what? I can't solve this problem on my own. It's too big. It's too big. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep my head down. I'm going to do what I do. I'm going to do the best job that I can possibly do and hope that I'm not contributing to the problem. But the reality is the key, and there's a very brilliant doctor at Johns Hopkins. His name is Peter Pronovost, that wrote the Checklist Manifesto. Great book if you're interested in reading that. But for him, he was like, these problems are solvable. These are human issues. We can make a difference. And he went after it. And he tweeted out a while back, and I wish I'd saved the whole tweet, but he said, the key really is not for it to be unimaginable, but we have to make it unacceptable. And it seems really, small in terms of semantics, but the reality is when we go from unimaginable, which is that space where I can't really comprehend, to this space where it's unacceptable for me for these statistics to remain stagnant year after year after year, and this many patients to be dying when they come to us for care and wellness, that's a quantum shift personally. That means, and that's where I am now, is I've gotten to the point where I've got to make a difference. So I take every opportunity, this being one of them, to speak about this stuff and try to make a difference. And you're probably asking yourself, well, why is it like that? Well, for one, I'm perpetuating the problem right now when I'm talking in terms of cold numbers, right? And it occurred to me years ago, and Tim and I have had this conversation on multiple occasions. It's like, what if we talked in terms of names instead of in terms of numbers? Would that make a difference in people and get them more excited about making a difference? And one day, I think it was at church, honestly, it occurred to me that there's a precedent already for that. And if you've ever been to Washington, D.C. on the mall and visited the Vietnam War Memorial, and I've got to fix this slide because it's actually Vietnam Veteran Memorial, it's all of the memorials there are very moving and emotional, but the Vietnam Veteran Memorial in particular is, because it's so simple in its design. It's just a wall with a ton of names on it. But if you really take into account what each one of those names means, it was someone who was born, who had dreams, who had ambitions, who had a family. And then all of a sudden the Vietnam conflict came along, and for whatever reason, whether they volunteered or got drafted, they wound up in Vietnam. And as a result, their life ended as a result of that war. And the human cost of that is inescapable when you walk along the length of that memorial. And to give you a little bit of a orientation about it, this is a Google Earth shot of the mall. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is down near the Lincoln Memorial. When you zoom in, it's actually two walls. They call it the wall, but it's actually two that intersect at a point. They're about 500 feet long, let's just say, for round numbers. Then there's about 58,000, a little over 58,200 names on the wall. The number actually changes as they update their data. But it occurred to me, so what if we built one of these walls for the patients that died just due to hospital-acquired infections? What would that look like? If we did that, we'd have to extend that wall out to a little over 635 feet. And that's just for 1 year. But it also occurred to me, so well, wait a minute, that's not really an apples to apples comparison. So if you're aware of the Vietnam War up until recently, and the War on Terror, the Vietnam conflict was the longest conflict in the history of the United States. Our involvement started in 53, I think, or no, 55, ended in 73. It was a little over 18 years long. And so if we were going to build a wall that lasted the same time span as the Vietnam War, what would that look like? And if we built that wall just for hospital-acquired infections, that wall would have to extend all the way from the Lincoln Memorial to the base of the Capitol building. It would be approximately 2 miles long. And if we wanted to keep it current, we'd have to add 2 feet per day every single day. So when I first did this and I came up with this analogy, I was like, my personal motto became, I have to shorten that wall. Now, we're never going to build that wall, right? Because we don't go out and we don't advertise that these are problems that we have. And a lot of times these numbers and these people are hard to identify. And I can tell you in my career, I've been involved in multiple investigations of infections where it was really hard to say with great certainty that it came from construction or maintenance. So they kind of fell out of the system, if you will. But nonetheless, the patient was gone. So now I know that the most famous astronaut in history is Boilermaker Neil Armstrong, but I wanted to introduce you to this guy. His name was Frank Borman. He actually was one of Mr. Armstrong's contemporaries. Colonel Borman was actually the commander of Apollo 8. And you guys, if you saw behind me, you can probably tell I'm a big NASA nerd too. But what he brings to this conversation was, and most everybody on this call is way too young to remember Apollo 1 actually happened before I was born too, but Apollo 1 was the original space flight for the Apollo system. And before they ever got to that point, they had a fire on the pad and killed all 3 astronauts. Colonel Borman, before he became famous for commanding Apollo 8, being the first to the moon, to orbit the moon anyway, he was responsible for the investigation of the accident. And it was a courtesy of that and an opportunity he got to testify before Congress. And when they asked him, he said, what was the ultimate cause of the fire? His response, I think, was brilliant and insightful when he said it was a failure of imagination. And we went on, and what he meant by that, and he went on to describe it. He said, there were all these things, these risk factors that we didn't take into account, that we never recognized as being significant, that added up into this tragedy. So the real root cause was we just didn't think of these issues. And what we do in healthcare, especially when we start working on the built environment, is risk assessment through imagination, right? So if nothing else, what I want you to think about is it's important for us to have an open mind when we go into these risk assessments. Not only for us internally, where I want to go in and go with no preconceived notions so I can have the best mindset, but also when there's others that come into play here and they may have what you would normally think is an outlandish concern. Every one of those is worth vetting because the sum of the parts is much more powerful than the individuals their own. So here are some of the things. I travel around the country quite a bit, go to hospitals, and I'm seeing are significant problems with construction. And they all have kind of a common thread, and it's the risk assessments not being deep enough or being too narrow is the term that I use. Mitigation plans that are too vague, and I'm going to go through these in a little bit more detail. So, we make some assumptions. We assume people are confident. We assume people are competent, and we also assume people are communicating well. I'm making assumptions right now that I'm communicating effectively with all you all. We also make assumptions that people are committed and have the commitment levels that we need to do this stuff right. And one of the things I want to say about commitment is that's not necessarily static. I mean, I think I'm about as committed as anyone when it comes to healthcare safety and doing my job. But on occasion, things happen. 2 of my best friends passed away this year from cancer. One was related somewhat to AHAI, on top of all the COVID stuff. So those kinds of things, when they introduce themselves into your life, can have a negative effect on your commitment to that would normally not be there. We fail to properly monitor. And I want to say this bottom point, gross negligence, is probably the by far the smallest fraction, but it's worth mentioning. I'd say 99.9% of the problems that I find fall in the first few categories, but then there's that every now and then. And I'll show you an example of that a little bit later. But what this means is a lot of times we run into situations where we don't have good differential pressure, and we're not managing our construction air handler equipment properly. We're not monitoring for pressure, and we're not reacting when we need to, and the tools that we use aren't functioning the way they need to. We haven't well thought out how we're going to get to and from the site and how that might impact areas outside of our construction project. We don't maintain the barriers, and sometimes they're not the ones we need. Sometimes they're not even complete. Tim touched upon life safety, and I'm going to mention that briefly, but the one thing that makes healthcare different from every other occupancy classification that you're likely to work on in your career, with the possible exception of prisons, is when there's a fire, we intend to stay. Because our patients are too sick to evacuate. Now, we do work on helping our staff help them evacuate, but that requires time. So our buildings are built differently, and these life safety features are critical to the protection of life in the event of a fire. One thing I think we overlook a lot is noise and vibration. And I know it's very difficult to do construction without making a little bit of noise and creating some vibrations, but there are populations that have significant risk factors related to those two. Neonates come to mind right out of the gate, especially noise, but also vibrations can cause brain damage, even death in neonates. But it also has an impact on populations like dementia, Alzheimer's, and behavioral health patients, as well as us being in the workspace and creating distractions can lead, unfortunately, to preventable medical errors just by the fact that we're there and we're creating a difference in the environment. The other thing is having emergency procedures, and when I talk about emergency procedures, I'm talking more about the what if something goes wrong on this project. How do we respond to that? A couple of other things that we should be considering is when we go through this, we're going to imagine the risk, and we need to try to identify as many as they are, even if they seem infinitesimally small relative to others. It's important to understand who needs to be on that team. Do we do it in a vacuum as a part of our construction company? The company do it? Does the project manager for the hospital do it? Does the facility manager do it? Does the infection preventionist do it? And I can tell you that what I've seen repeatedly is that when you get all of the proper players in the room face to face, or maybe in today's world via Zoom, the end result is so much better than you can possibly get with individuals doing these things, simply because of the different perspectives. I recently was working with a hospital system, and because of time restrictions, they decided they would do risk assessments kind of in a linear format, but they'd have all these people involved: the IEP, the infection preventionist, the construction manager, the safety officer, facility manager, everybody you would want on that team. But instead of meeting, they were just passing this thing around in an email chain. And as a result, they were having lots of problems. And those problems probably, in fact, did ultimately resolve themselves when they abandoned that process and got back to having face-to-face meetings. If you're using reusable wall sections, which you're becoming the cool, hot new thing, I think OmniGuard, those companies, what's the process for making sure those things are clean when you take them into a hospital, and more importantly, when you take them out? These are the kinds of things that we don't even think about. Again, failure of imagination, right? How are you going to monitor the safety and your construction risk mitigation plan? Who's involved in that? Who gets triggered? If you're doing particle counts, where do you take those readings? How do you analyze that data so you've got the air quality that you need? The biggest piece, and I probably should have bolded this one, is like, how do you train people? The key to solving all these problems is education. And that education starts at the top and it works down, and sometimes it starts down and works to the top. But everybody involved in that process and on that project needs to have some level of understanding of what we're trying to achieve from a risk mitigation perspective. So to give you an example of that, if you've got subs, the folks that are doing access control systems that may be there just for a couple of days, they still need to understand why we have these barriers in place, and why we're doing differential pressure, and why you've got to walk on the sticky mats, and why, all of these things that may seem like ridiculous steps to them, that they all equate to safety for our patients. Who's got the responsibility and the authority to shut down the project if necessary? One of the things that we were doing a major project renovating the OR, and we had a phone at the nurses station in the OR. And that phone, it was a direct line to a light and a speaker inside the construction site. And as soon as they picked up the phone, the light flashed and they could say stop, and everybody was trained to stop. That actually worked really, really well. There were a couple of false alarms on that. We dealt with that. But the ability to be able to say and shut down due to patient safety is pretty critical. The other one is, how do you define clean? And that's something that, I can tell you that infection prevention's definition of clean is probably far different than yours and mine. It's certainly different than an average general contractor. So coming to some agreement as to what is clean for a construction perspective is really important. So let's talk about this risk assessment thing. And one of the things I want to talk about there is you got to think three-dimensionally when you start looking at what areas of the hospital might be impacted by this project that we're doing. And even if we're working outside, we tend to think in boxes when we do projects. Well, we're only working on the second floor, and that's SPD, so we don't have to think about anything else. Well, but what surrounds SPD? What's below it? What's above it? If we're going to put a buck hoist on the outside to move material in and out, how will that interact with the air intakes for our air handlers? And if we're creating a higher dust level than we would normally have in those intakes, are our filter systems capable of dealing with that or not? But thinking about the entire hospital and how our project might interact is a real critical part of this. You've probably seen this little matrix. We use it, almost every hospital in the country uses it. In Canada, they use something that's very similar. It's a little bit different, but not a lot. But it's a really simple matrix. We got, types A through D, construction projects, A being, minor paint kind of thing, and D being we're going to tear it down and rebuild it. And then we've got patient risk populations. And most of our patients, unfortunately, are going to fall into the highest risk categories. And we decide, well, okay, we're doing a type D construction project. We're in a highest risk group, so it's going to be a type 4 construction. And then that leads to something like this. And most of you have probably seen this. Just about every hospital, like I said, in the country uses something very similar. They say it's risk class 4. Here are the things we want to do. But I have two problems with this as being our risk mitigation plan. The first one being is we tend to think of it as being static. So what I mean by that is we do that risk assessment, the ICRA, the infection control risk assessment, before we ever start the project. And then that type 4 that I just posted for you becomes our infection control risk mitigation recommendations, which is the plan we're going to do to obviously try to minimize the risk to the patients. And we think about that as being appropriate all the way from start to finish. But in reality, we know as we go through a typical construction process or project, there are times when we're generating a lot more dust and we're maybe doing demolition of areas that have been stagnant for a long period of time. And so the danger actually changes over the lifespan of that project. And if we go with this one and done concept, we end up with a lot of overkill, frankly, and occasional areas where maybe we're not doing enough. And I'm not suggesting that we redo the ICRA every day or every several times a day, but each time a major area or activity changes for the hospital, we should at least think about it. We're getting ready to do major demolition of plumbing systems that have been shut off and stagnant for 8 months. Does our current infection control risk mitigation recommendations account for that, and are they sufficient? And that sort of thinking is how we get to a higher level. The other thing that I don't really like about this, and I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying there's room for improvement, is a lot of times what happens is the hospital will do this risk assessment and they'll hand this document that I'm showing on the screen to you right now to the contractor, usually the superintendent, and say, here you go, here's your infection control plan. And so if you look and you kind of read these statements, they're all pretty vague, right? I mean, basically it's like, okay, isolate the HVAC system. What does that actually mean, right? What do I really expect from that? Or, put a barrier, create differential pressure. Well, what kind of barrier? Where does it need to be? How much differential pressure? And so a much more effective process, and this is, trust me, is a very, very simple infection control risk mitigation plan from a small renovation project in a interventional cath lab or radiology lab, where we got a little bit more specific. So we want, here's where you put your barrier. We need an ante room. We want there to be a differential pressure with an alarm that rings back to our command center. We want there to be at least one HEPA construction unit, and it to be ducted out in the corridor here at this location. But even this plan was really too vague for a contractor to implement it effectively. So, the next iteration of this is, we say, okay, build this wall out of these materials, place it here. We want a 1000 CFM HEPA filtered unit, and we're going to take it over through the ceiling, through a dedicated duct to this location in a lower risk area of the hospital. And you kind of can see where we're going with that, right? This is a plan that you can hand to a superintendent that they can have a much higher likelihood of success. But again, there's even quite a bit of room to improve here. So let's talk about competency and communication for a minute. This is probably the best communication example I can give you. So you can see this thing, it's hard to believe it's like almost 7 years ago that I took this picture, because I remember it like it was yesterday, but I was at one of my clients and we were actually using a particle counter, one of those Fluke 985s. We were walking through the hospital. We were actually looking for another problem, not related to construction. And all of a sudden we started getting these really high readings. We're like, what the heck's going on? So, the first thing I will say when you talk about particle counts is never get too freaked out by one reading, because, sometimes it can be as simple as somebody walks by, with a lot of, dust on them or whatever, and it spikes the meter. But in this case, after the third or fourth sample, we're like, okay, this is really a problem. So we got a ladder, went to the supply, and the air coming out of the supply was really high and much higher than we expected. So we started digging and we found this spot. This was a little renovation project that was going on. And they had gotten that same kind of bulleted ICRA form from the infection preventionists, and it said isolate the HVAC system. And this is what the contractor decided was meeting that requirement. That's actually a MERV 8, which, if you know anything about filters, a MERV 8 is basically a pre-filter. It is almost completely ineffective at the particle sizes that we're worried about, which is somewhere between 0.5 and 1 microns in size. And this is a contractor that we'd worked with for years. And so I knew immediately when we started talking, well, actually what we did was we got the infection preventionist to come in there. We all looked at it and I said, is this what you guys expected from an ICRA perspective? And she goes, no, we thought they would seal it up with plastic and duct tape and, et cetera, et cetera. And Jason, the superintendent, was just like, oh my gosh, I thought that's what I was doing. True failure of communication that could have had a really negative outcome. Fortunately, we caught it pretty quickly. Here's another one that kind of related to competency, and we see this a lot. We go to the effort of sealing this ductwork. And why do we do that? Well, we do that for a couple of reasons, but the primary reason is we don't want to build into our systems infection prevention issues. And so, if our people are properly trained, we as inspectors shouldn't come into construction sites consistently and see things like this. The way that we're going to get to where that wall is smaller than the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is by empowering people with knowledge so that they can see something like this and go, that's wrong. I got to fix that problem. Here's another example. This is a HEPA unit, and you can see it's basically ducted to nothing, right? So what's happening is there's air going into it, and really there's real clean air coming out of the other side, but that air's not going anywhere. So we're not creating any differential pressure, for one. And if you've ever played around with water in an aquarium, or you stood in a stream and watched water go around you when you're swimming, you know that there's eddies and things all throughout that room that are not seeing the cleaning that unit is possible of providing. Scrubbers are great, but if they're not used to create differential pressure, they're almost ineffective. But this is one of those things where, there was really not clear instructions, and they actually argued that this is creating negative pressure. And I was like, how is this creating differential pressure? And we went to several locations where we could see that the construction site was actually positive to the rest of the building, and I was able to convince them. Another example, this is actually, there's two things about this picture that made me take it. This is obviously an ineffective way to get air out of a construction air handler and out of the building, but this is actually a low return in an OR. You never want to use returns for where we send construction air. It's just a really bad idea. And in this case, we're doing it in OR, which is a super bad idea. But what saved them was the fact that they did such a bad job. Most of the air was coming back into the construction site anyway. Couple of other examples. Actually, I'm going to skip this picture to show you this one because this one makes more sense. So this is the HEPA. What you're seeing is the back end of the HEPA unit here and the actual HEPA filter itself. And the way these things work, is most of them at least, use some compression fittings or compression struts that allow us to tighten that filter really well across a gasket to prevent any leakage around it. Because again, what we want is all of our air in the construction site passing through this HEPA filter, which is going to, at an efficiency of 99.97%, remove particles of 0.3 microns and greater. And that's how we get to this ultra clean air and make sure that we're not contaminating other areas of the occupied space. Again, using the particle counter, the numbers were telling us we had a problem. When we started tearing down the unit, we found out, well, they put the HEPA filter in here, but they never tightened the compression struts. So failure to do that is what caused bypass, right? We're getting dust particles, and actually the particles that we were most concerned about, the smallest ones, were very efficiently getting beyond this filter. So once we explained that to them, they figured it out, tightened it up, we used the particle counter and proved it was correct. But that was, again, a competency issue. Here's another example. This was down, it's OR. You can see the back doors saying, surgical attire required. This is the main entrance to the OR at a hospital I was working with. And they were doing construction on both sides of the corridor. And you can see, if you look at the upper right, you can see the air is coming out from the construction air handler and that little area on the right. But if you look at the left, you can see the telltale signs of a positive pressured construction site. You see how that just bows out ever so slightly, which was my first clue that there was a problem. The bad thing about this, the reason it was critical, is every patient that goes into the OR goes right through this area, and every patient that comes out of the OR comes right through this area. In fact, you can see the PPE for the scrubs and the things to wear to go into the department are right there in front of the door. So having bad air quality here puts those patients at great risk. Doing a little bit of root cause, how did this happen? Relatively new project manager here. She actually was her first project. She only had one unit. And she said, well, I had one unit, but I knew I was supposed to get started on the job. So I chose the bigger side, and that's where it went. It wasn't that she had nefarious intent or any kind of, was malicious. It's just she didn't know what she didn't know. So it was a little bit of communication, but also a little bit of competency, quick, easy to correct. This is another great example of communication. And this is a hospital, it's 11 stories. I know this never happens for most of you guys, but the project was behind by about 6 weeks. And so, long story short, the owner had already told the world the hospital's going to open on such and such a date, and everybody was feeling the pressure. Well, at some point on the schedule, materials management had been informed that they needed to stock all of the supply rooms, the clean and sterile supply rooms within this bed tower that was going to open on this certain date. And no one ever told them that we were behind. So one day we show up, and every clean storage room within this tower that had not even been construction cleaned at that point had these supplies in it. And that was a very expensive mistake. Fortunately, we caught it, and all of this stuff had to either be cleaned, or if it couldn't be cleaned, discarded, which is where the expense came into play. But it could have been much worse. So talk about commitment a little bit. And to me, a lot of people look at this and they go, well, it's plastic barrier. To me, I see this and I'm like, this tells me two problems right out of the gate. People don't understand what they're looking at, and people aren't committed to doing it right. If you look at it, I'll give you some of the hints. It's barely sealed at the bottom with a couple of pieces of painter's tape, sealed with one piece of painter's tape on the side, not sealed at the top. They use just clips. And on top of that, it's positive pressure in the construction site. So this is just bad all the way around. It looks good, but it's not doing anything for us. And what we want is people to look at that and go, wait a minute, this is unacceptable. We cannot live with this. We need to fix this before we proceed with the project. Here's another good example. This one's kind of a funny story. You're seeing in this picture the whole project, okay? This is it, the whole square footage. And you see 4 air handlers here, all ducted outside. It literally, when I opened the door, it sucked me right into the room. I'm like, holy crap, what's going on? And I asked the guy, I was like, wow, you guys are really creating some differential pressure here, aren't you? And he said, yeah, well, it's what it took. It took 4 units to get to 0.3 microns of differential pressure. Like, I think what you're trying to get to is 0.03. I said microns, I meant water, inches of water column. And so decimal places matter, right? They were way over what they needed, which created some other problems in the occupied spaces below. But the reason I really took this picture is this HEPA cart that's in here. So like a lot of these projects, there were some little mini projects associated with it outside that wouldn't be practical to be contained with the typical construction barriers. So they're using the HEPA cart to seal up and do that work. But every time that they finished one of those projects, they just rolled it in here where we were doing all this demolition, and then they would grab it and they would roll it out without any type of thought of cleaning it or disinfecting it, et cetera. So again, failure of imagination, but with the best of intentions, putting patients at risk. I threw this slide in here mainly because of you have to be really important about things that can defeat your best plans, and bad vacuum cleaners can be one of them. And there's a lot of vacuum cleaners on the market that claim to be HEPA filtered, but they really aren't. So understanding what you're buying and how it's being used and where it's being used is really important. I wouldn't go to the point of certifying a HEPA vacuum, but making sure that it is UL rated for that purpose is important. I took this picture. I was doing a mock Joint Commission survey a while back. And the day before we had visited this construction site, and it was really good. And the reason I took this picture is this is one of those things. It's like, be careful to the very end and think about what you're doing when you're doing it. The project was over. They'd done everything they could do to try to minimize the impact on the rest of the organization. And in the very last phase, they took this construction barrier down. They just rolled it up, threw it in a cart, and were rolling it through the hospital. And you can see we caught them as they were about to go through the pediatric area. One simple step of covering that to ensure that the dust that's been trapped by that barrier for the last several months doesn't get introduced all the way up and down the hall would have made this I would have never taken the picture. One good way of communicating this, and I got to give credit to Gordon Burrell, my good friend from Canada and good friend of Tim's, came up with this concept, and I think it's brilliant. And I've used this to help communicate it to frontline folks, laborers, and think those are responsible for doing things like taking that barrier and why they should cover it, the people who are responsible for ripping off sticky mats and that sort of stuff. And it's the 1 in 20 rule, and it's really simple. 1 in 20 of all the patients admitted to our hospitals will get a hospital-acquired infection. So roughly, and this has been pretty stagnant over the last decade or so, we have about 35 million admissions in our hospitals every year. Do the math, that's about 1.5 million infections. Like I said, one of my friends, unfortunately, passed away, not from the infection, but from the cancer, but he got an HAI while he was at Duke. I shouldn't have said that out loud, but probably a preventable one. But 1 in 20 said, will get one. 1 in 20 of those infected will die from that infection. So that's that 75,000 number that I gave you a little while ago. 1 in 20 of those will be directly related to construction or maintenance activities. So what that equates to is 14 patients will die every day on average in our country due to what we are doing in our facilities. And while we're talking about this and the time that we've been on this screen, at least one on average will die. And my belief, and I believe this more strongly today than I did even yesterday, is that death is absolutely 100% preventable. If we do our due diligence, and if we imagine the possibilities, going back to Colonel Warman, and we do our best, our level best to mitigate all of the risks that are out there, that one patient doesn't need to die. And then we can focus our efforts on, instead of the 6,000 related to construction, the other 69,000 that could use our help as well. So failure to monitor is another issue. And so one of the things we do is we use tools like MagnaHelix and other devices to help us identify whether our spaces have the proper differential pressure or not. And that was the case with this one. And you can see I've got my finger over that, the intake, and it actually didn't move. And then moments later, one of my colleagues, I took that picture of him holding the tissue up, showing that there's air actually moving out of the construction site. And so what we found was that MagnaHelix, it's got a little set screw, and in fact, you can see it right there underneath the little caution thing. had never been set properly, had never been zeroed. And we found several like that. And I don't think anything about that was malicious, but it was incredibly misleading to those that were monitoring the project, assuming that we had good differential pressure and that we had clean air flowing into our construction sites and the dirty air was all flowing out to the outdoors, when in reality, we had dirty air coming out of our construction site into the occupied spaces. Excuse me. And then we've got this situation again. You know, I actually watched this person do a cable pull and they created all this dust in this thing. And then they unzipped it and walked out and just left it there. You know, so that was a little bit of monitoring and also a little bit of an education issue. Another example, not really understanding where the line should be drawn. There are two problems with this barrier, by the way. One is it's positive pressure, but two, we got someone working outside of the containment field, right? And the reason they were doing that, we talked about it. It's like, well, there was no convenient place to put this construction barrier, so we built it here, even though we knew it wouldn't fully enclose the construction site. That was a failure of understanding the risk, right? That someone who made that decision needed a little bit better education. Then the last part of this is negligence. Like I said, 99% do it right. And then there's that 1%, maybe less than 1% that do stuff like this. And what you're seeing here is the ball through the wall. Those things they're cool. You know, I wish I had invented the thing, because that's like $8 worth of parts maybe, and they sell for like $200. I mean, I would not be, I'd be living a lot differently if I'd invented it. But the problem with it, if you look really careful, it's just kind of set on an angle, right? So what's going to happen? Where's that ball going to be if it's on a 10-degree plane like this? Well, it's going to be inside, right? And so a little bit deeper investigation. This was actually an OR project. And we stumbled across this project because we were doing a life safety assessment for the facility. And we were working at night. We always do the ORs at night to minimize the risk to everyone involved. And so we came across this, and we noticed that ball. I said, man, that thing's set on an angle. I took that picture. And we found 3 more like that. So then we went into the construction site and we found out why, because they had an open cavity and the site wasn't negative, but the project manager ultimately admitted that they couldn't get it negative. So they basically installed the balls the way they did. So it would show negative, which is not cool. Here's another example, and I'll be completely honest about this one. So what I'm showing you here is a magma helix on the side of a HEPA unit that's being used to remove air from a construction site in an operating room. And it's I've got one client that pretty much monopolizes my time now. I spend far too much time with them. But this is in the middle, towards the end of a major construction project with them. And I've used this example for 2 reasons. One is to let you know how badly things can go wrong when relationships deteriorate. And so to fully understand my role in this, I was kind of the watchdog from a patient safety, construction risk perspective. I was the third party that the hospital brought in to provide quality assurance. So there was a little bit of an adversarial relationship with the contractor from the outset. And to give you an idea how far the relationship between the contractor and the hospital deteriorated after this, but it was already getting to that point. In order for the hospital to talk to someone, the contractor, they had to call their attorney, who called the contractor's attorney, who then called the contractor. So when you have that kind of adversarial relationship set up, the only people who win, I promise you, are the attorneys who get paid every time you pick up the phone and try to resolve something. So I give you all of that background because I walked into this construction site and there were actually 2 units sitting side by side. One of them was reading 2.5 inches and one of them looked like this. So if you understand what's going on here is what we're measuring is the pressure drop across that HEPA filter bank. So the one that was reading 2.5 inches is what I would have expected. This I would not. So there were 1 or 2 things that's going on. Either this unit wasn't working properly or this magma helix had failed. But either way, the contractor or whoever was doing the day-to-day safety round should have picked up on this. So I pointed it out and said, I think we got a problem with that unit. Well, that started a big, huge confrontation and, accusations of just, trying to shut down the project. And the facility manager, who's a good friend and kind of a hothead, he's one of those guys. He and the superintendent were nose to nose, and I took advantage of that opportunity and just shut the unit down and opened it up. And when I did, I found out there was no HEPA filter in it at all, which would explain this very, very low reading, because all we had was a MERV 8. But what was really scary about that is we're doing demolition in the OR. That air is going directly out into the sterile core where all the other patients are having surgery. And not only are we not protecting them with a HEPA filter, we're taking very dirty air out of the construction site and very efficiently, I might add, depositing it into other sterile areas. So it was a watershed moment for me. I don't know if this was competency. I don't know if it was negligence, but I know it was bad. And we'd had problems with that before, and we had problems with that again. And that's one of the reasons why they're no longer allowed to do work at this hospital. Quickly, and I know we're kind of running out of time, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the tools of the trade. You've heard me talk a lot about particle counters. And hopefully you guys, this is not a new tool for you guys, but this is one of the best tools you can use to make sure that your infection prevention measures are being done appropriately and are effective. And what I try to do, and I think this is probably a good lesson in communication when you're talking to people within the hospital, particularly clinical people, is understand that they have a whole different vocabulary than you do, and vice versa. And they're going to talk to you about, stuff. And what I do, I say, hey, you're talking medical, speak English, please, because I don't do medical. And for them, I try not to speak in engineering terms, and I don't talk about microns, and I don't talk about water column. But what I do, I tell the nurses that are typically, is what a lot of the IPs are, is they start out as nurses, say, this particle counter to me is a thermometer to you. Okay. When I use this thing, it doesn't tell me what the disease is, but it tells me there's a symptom that needs to be addressed, and now I need to dig deeper. But if I don't have a fever, in other words, my numbers are in good shape, then we don't have to worry about the issue. So having this tool, the way we're using them now, thanks to going back 2 slides, right, too far, right here. After this, we implemented a very strict process where we use one of these to commission our construction air handling units before we put them into service. And the way we do that is we take the particle counter in, we measure what's going into the unit, and then we measure what's coming out. And if we don't get a 99.9% reduction, we fail the unit until they get it right. Once they get it right, they hook it up to the ductwork where we repeat that test. And if we're somewhere around 98, 99%, we figure that's good enough and we turn them loose. But that's one of the ways that we have taken this safety to the next level at that particular hospital and now throughout the system. We literally have it, we call it the construction air handler commissioning policy. So that's another way we use that tool. But this is, for me, is probably the single greatest tool that I can use to make sure that we're doing everything we need to do. This data that you have when you do it and you do it right can be invaluable in a situation where you've got some patients that get an infection, particularly fungal infections. And we actually were doing a project. It was in Pennsylvania area, and there were some aspergillosis, easy for me to say, infections that occurred within the hospital. And of course, the first thing they did was say, well, your project, it's your project. You've done something wrong. And I don't think we have. I think we're in good shape. And we had particle counts, for daily particle counts, where we were going outside, getting outdoor air samples, and we were comparing the air quality throughout the hospital to what was immediately surrounding the construction site, which, by the way, most hospitals use MERV 15, maybe MERV 16 filters, which aren't nearly as efficient as HEPA's. And if you're doing it right, the air adjacent to a construction project will often be a little bit cleaner than the air in the rest of the hospital. We knew we had good differential pressure monitoring equipment that was recording, and I'll show you that here in just a second. But we took all this data and we went back to the IP team and we said, we really don't think this problem came from us. So what it did was they went, oh, well, okay, we need to look for other possibilities. And when they did, they found out that it didn't come from us. It actually came from somewhere else completely. unassociated with the construction project. But in the absence of having all that data, we all would have been scratching our heads and maybe it did come from us. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to do this sort of thing. Differential pressure monitors, a magnet helix, great, but it won't call me if the pressure drops on the weekend, which it's critical to have that stuff working the whole time. And I don't work for OmniGuard. I just stole this picture off the internet, so forgive me. But having a device that you can hook up that will monitor the pressure, that will send a text, an email, Slack message, whatever, to someone and say, hey, there's a problem here, it needs to be addressed, is a very important part of this monitoring process. And now we're getting devices that are much more sophisticated, where we can do multiple channels, so we can measure, what's the pressure outside, what's the pressure differential for the anteroom, what's the pressure differential from the anteroom into the construction site, and record all that data for future use. So those are a couple of things that I think are really important. So how do we solve this problem and get rid of the 1 in 20 rule forever and stop building our own memorials to patients? Well, it starts with education. And I'm just educate everybody you can think of. And in fact, I was in Indianapolis not long ago, maybe a year or so ago, and I started out the presentation by stating, and it may be somebody on this call that came up to me afterwards. I said, I'm here to create disciples, because I can't solve this problem alone. And I'm going to feel like it's a win if I can convince a couple of you all to go back and educate your teams about this stuff. And at the end of the presentation, someone came down front and said, gee, man, I thought you were going to do an altar call there, which was kind of embarrassing. But anyway, education is really important, and adjust your message. I just talked about the fact that the clinical people have a different vocabulary than we do. And you can kind of make that assumption for a lot of the disciplines. So talk in terms they can understand. And if you're having trouble understanding what they're saying to you, do not be ashamed or afraid to say, can you explain that to me? Because I really want to get this right. I want to make sure that we're clear. And this is something we have to counsel everybody gets in consulting about. So don't be afraid to not have all the answers. Nobody does. Nobody does. Make sure you got the right tools for the job, the particle counters and all those things I just showed you. Leading by example. This one I cannot emphasize enough. And leading by example is a top-down, bottom-up thing. Right? Everybody has to be involved. And sometimes I'm amazed at how, it's the people that get it and understand what we're trying to do that have a big impact on the people, their bosses and their boss's boss, and all the way up the chain of command, just because they're going the extra mile to try to prevent these infections. And the way they get to that point is starting with why it's important. And I don't know if any of y'all read Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why. If you got time and you're a TED Talk person, or even if you're not, put into Google Simon Sinek TED Talk. It's a 15-minute Start With Why. It's worth every second of that 15 minutes. And it changes your perspective about how you go about your job and educating people that you work with. And I tried to get him, honestly, to speak at ISHE a couple of years ago, and found out, I think he charges $200,000 for 90 minutes, or he did back then. So coming up with a three-word phrase, Start With Why, has been very lucrative for good old Simon. But you think about it in its simplicity, helping people understand why it's important to do what they do makes it a lot easier for them to accomplish their task. And to give you an example is, we don't want anything but water on our construction sites, right? We don't want to bring Cokes and food articles and things into the construction site. Why? Because they're going to be essentially pest bait, right? We're going to leave crumbs behind and, sugary stains that cause roaches and rodents and all those things. We don't want to build into a brand new pristine hospital an infection control problem related to pests. But if you don't explain that to the construction teams, and you say, we're not going to let you bring, your Red Bull on the site because you're just not allowed, you're just a jerk. That's at least how you're perceived. So I am convinced, and the few times that I've had the opportunity to really explain why, that when you see that light bulb go off, it's going to be a different world the next day, and it always is. Develop measurable and monitorable. I made that word up. I think it's cool. I don't know if it's made up or what. But anyway, plans that you can monitor, that's critical, right? this is the air quality we're going to maintain. This is the differential we're going to maintain. This is what we're going to expect to see when we tour the site, how often sticky mats are going to be removed. All of the things that you think are critical steps to protecting patients and your people that are working out there, because let's face it, you're putting yourself at risk as well, particularly bloodborne pathogens. Capture that data, monitor that data, and you know what I left out of that is document that. Documentation is really important. Make sure that your plans, there's some authority behind them. So when you find a problem, like I did with that air handler, that you can say, stop the project till we get to the bottom of this. And that's not a popular thing to do. In fact, it takes a little bit of bravery and courage to do it, but it's the right thing to do if there's legitimate concerns. And then finally, just be willing to say goodbye, right? If there is a contractor or subcontractor, someone on the team that just doesn't have the level of commitment that they need to do this and protect the patients within our facility, find somebody else. Let them go build, Walmarts or, Amazon warehouses or whatever is the hot thing to do now, but they don't belong in healthcare. And they're 1 in a million, but they are out there. And I've experienced in my career, and I'm sure I will again. So a couple of things before I turn you over, because I know you guys got to leave in like 4 minutes. If you're interested in learning more about this, on our website, there is a presentation for the ISHE guys and anybody who wants to use it. That's intended, it's free, obviously, that is intended to use for training folks. It's got stuff like chain of infection and some of the broader concepts in there, and it's meant for the facilities teams to take it, customize it, use it for training their people, and anybody else that they wanted to use it for. And my only request is that if you make it better, you send us a copy of it so we can put a better version out there. But that's free for you. And the other thing is we've got, if you want to learn more about what I just spent, I don't even know how many minutes we were talking about, maybe an hour, talking about all this stuff. We've got a podcast, which you can get to through iTunes or any of the podcasting places that speak to a lot. The first, I think, 6 episodes are all about construction. So a lot more detail, a lot more people than just me talking to. So I encourage you to use those. And I will end with my favorite construction barrier photo of all time. Surprised I don't frame that and put it up in here. This actually, when I saw this, they argued with me that this was creating differential pressure because it looked like it was bowed in towards the construction site, which I got a good giggle out of that. Fortunately, they hadn't started the project yet, so the risks were really not that great. But I appreciate your time. I certainly wish you all the best, and I'm happy to take, if I can figure out how to do this, Melissa, stop sharing my screen. Take any questions that anyone might have for the 3 minutes you have remaining.
So this is Don. I'll just interject real quick. There's one question on the dashboard, but it says, what are your thoughts about discharging a HEPA filtered fan into an adjacent space versus discharging out of a window or exhaust duct?
That's a great question. So I don't have a problem with doing that if you are absolutely certain your HEPA filter is working the way it's intended to work. And the only way you can be absolutely certain is with a device like I just showed you, that particle counter, and going through that commissioning process. But let me add one quick story. So velocity matters. One of my sites, we had some infections that we were trying to track down. And one of the fellow ISHE members, a guy named Andy Streibel, he's a brilliant guy that knows molds better than anybody. I'd never heard of this substance before. I called him and he goes, it's a very heavy spore, Steve. You need to look for high velocity air. And what we tracked it down to was this construction air handler that was in the corridor that had air coming out at a high velocity from a little 4-inch round duct. And they were rolling supplies that had been contaminated by this pathogen in central supply past that unit, and it was lifting those heavy spores off of that unit and caused 3 infections. Fortunately, no one died, but now, in the week before, I had looked at that unit and I'm like, this is awesome. I measured it. It was clean. I had no problem with it, but I learned something new about this process every single day, which is what makes it fun.
Let's jump to Brad real quick. Any questions from your group? I know we're running really short on time.
Yeah, I'll throw it out to the students. You guys have any questions? And I'll throw one in there of, as a recovering contractor before I came to Purdue, I always reflect back on how much time we spent on fire safety and fire partitions and fire caulk and all of that stuff in the time in comparison to spending on all of that. And I'm not saying it's not important, but compared to infection control, I'd love to, you know, Steve, I'm sure you probably know these numbers here of we really are, we got to move the needle to where our attention really is as far as the number of lives we can save. You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wrestle with that all the time. I mean, we're down to less than 1 death per year in hospitals related to fire. Of course, we got to that point from in the 70s where we had 20 plus deaths per year related to fire because of diligence to the life safety. Well, advances in the life safety code and diligence to the life safety code. So I got to be careful because I don't want people to go, oh, forget the life safety code. Fire is not important, because it is. But certainly it's time for us to say the problem that's facing us today are these hospital-acquired infections and the preventable medical errors. And the only way we can really impact the errors is by minimizing our footprint when we're on site, right? I mean, we try not to be in their way and distract them, I think, but the infections we can absolutely have an impact on. And COVID has really illustrated how facilities are vitally important in this. You know, we have an opportunity. I hate to say there's an opportunity coming out of a pandemic, but we have an opportunity now. The clinical people see us a lot differently today than they did a year ago. Would you agree with that, Don? I mean,
Yeah.
I think they understand our not that they didn't really get us before, but I think they are all of a sudden like, wow, we need to understand airflow, and that's going to be probably a big theme at PDC this year, by the way, is you know how COVID has impacted us and what we're going to do. And I know you guys got to go, and I'm sorry, but
I see a bunch of students there with the backpacks at their feet, probably ready to go. But thank you, Brad, and all the students. We appreciate so much your participation today and the opportunity to learn more about what you all do. And obviously, we're very excited and grateful about the prospect of working with you all soon, having you in our facilities. And we will get, I'll follow up with Brad to get the list of equipment that you all can use, and we'll get that shared with our membership, as I mentioned earlier. Any other questions for anyone?
I'll say if you get questions, send them to me. I'll do my best to answer.
Yeah, very good. I know there's a couple more questions that came through on the question tab, and we'll get with Dave and try to get those to Steve or whoever for some answers and get that back out to the group.
I tell you what, I'll go home and release the Purdue students, keep going, but just real quick, thank you on behalf of all these young people here at Purdue. We really appreciate it. Love the presentation, love everything, and just thank you for everything.
Thank you guys for choosing healthcare, because my life and a lot of people's lives depend on it. So, and thank you for your time. Thank you, Melissa, for giving me the opportunity.
Well, thank you. And I know Tim is back on his mock survey rounds, but again, huge thanks to you, Steve, for everybody who joined us today. I think we may have mentioned at the beginning, but ISHE did approve this for continuing education units, I believe 2 hours. So you should get an email with a certificate. They may have already hit your email, your inbox, for all I know. And we will have the link to this recording posted. That usually goes up 48 to 72 hours. So there's a tremendous amount of invaluable information shared. Steve, like I said, the first time I heard you speak about this stuff, it totally changed, what I do and how you look at things and frame things, and it's made a huge difference. So thank you again. If nobody has anything else urgent, we will sign off, and thank you again for your time and participation today.
Very good. Thank you
all. See you guys.